All right, hello everyone. Welcome to OpenSSF's first Tech Talk, Building a Stronger Open Source Ecosystem, OpenSSF Scorecard. Next slide. So welcome everyone. We will be using the Zoom feature for Q&As. So as we go through the presentations and the panel, feel free to use the Q&A feature and we'll address all the questions at the end. In the meantime, also follow us on Twitter, Mastodon, and LinkedIn, and check out our website for all of the other OpenSSF resources. Next slide. So a quick view at the agenda. We'll start with some housekeeping, and then we'll go over some introductions of all of our panelists. And we'll do an introduction of Scorecard itself for people that don't know, and we'll do a deeper dive on OpenSSF Scorecard by one of the Scorecard maintainers. We'll then go into the insights from implementing organizations, talking about the use cases of Scorecard, and then we'll wrap it up with a panel discussion with a couple questions, and then take questions from the audience. Next slide. All right, so starting with some housekeeping, just wanted to quickly mention that this Tech Talk and all Linux Foundation activities are conducted in accordance with all the applicable antitrust and competition laws, and more information can be found on the slide here and at the link in the slide below. Next slide. And all of the participants here, I don't think I need to say this, but we're all expected to be respectful and behave with professional standards, which I know we will. And finally, just to reiterate, the Q&A button is right there. Feel free to answer your questions. We might be able to squeeze in a question or two during the talks, but most of the questions will be answered at the end. Thank you. All right, so let's introduce the panelists. Starting with me. Hello, everyone. I'm Caroline Lee. I'm your moderator today, and I am a security engineer in the CISO office at IBM. I've been a contributor to Scorecard for a year now, and it's been a great experience collaborating with maintainers and learning more about the different features of Scorecard. And recently, I've been made a triager to help review issues in code. Next slide. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. So hi, folks. I'm Chris Swan. I'm an engineer at Sign, where we're building a next-generation networking platform. Security is really important to us and our customers, so we use Scorecard as a way of showing that we care about security. We've been doing that for a little over a year now. I think I'm predominantly a Scorecard user, but I had my first PR merged into the Scorecard repo last week.
All right, let's get into Melba.
Hey folks, my name is Melba Lopez, and I am a senior technical staff member at IBM for the Office of CISO. And my main responsibility is the strategy and delivery of supply chain security for IBM as a whole. I used to be a lead for SALSA positioning SIG, which then was promoted to supply chain integrity positioning, and co-lead for the supply chain integrity working group. I've since retired from that and mostly work on OWASP dependency track as a maintainer. And I've been using Scorecard since the beginning of 2022 and looking forward to this talk, and thanks everyone for joining.
Finally, we have Laurent.
Hi, I'm Laurent. I'm also a security engineer at Google in the open source security team. I've been a maintainer of Scorecard, I think, for the past 2.5 years. Yeah, I work on supply chain and various topics like Scorecard, SALSA, and other interesting things.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. So I wanted to get started with an introduction to OpenSSF Scorecard for a brief overview before we get into the nitty-gritty details. Next slide. So for those who aren't super familiar, OpenSSF Scorecard is an automated tool to assess the different best practices and security projects of open source projects using a variety of checks rated from a score from 1 to 10. Scorecards often used by open source consumers to judge the trustworthiness of their dependencies, and also for open source maintainers themselves to help improve their own project and check that they're in line with best practices. So currently, Scorecard has 18 different built-in checks that address all the different aspects of the software supply chain. And on the right, you can see an image of the different areas that Scorecard encompasses. So just as an example, Scorecard would utilize tools OSV to check for code vulnerabilities in its code and dependencies. And it would perform maintenance type checks to see if a project is actively maintained and it has a good variety of contributors from varying organizations. It would also check to see if there's continuous testing and automated tools in place. For example, if there's SAS scanning, if there's fuzzing, and if there's CI testing in the project repo. And lastly, there's a risk assessment of the source code and the build's product. There's a lot of different checks, but just a few of them. It checks if there are binaries present, if there is a license file in the project, and if releases are being signed and packages are being published in an official manner. So with all of these checks, they're all compiled into a final score from 1 to 10. So you can check the security score with just a quick glance. Next slide. And one of the best features of Scorecard is that it's super lightweight and easy to use. It can be run using the GitHub action in a CI manner automatically, and you can run it manually through the command line interface. And Scorecard is also performed weekly on 1.2 million different critical open source projects with the results saved in a BigQuery data set. And you can review the results of these scans with a UI, as you can see here in OpenSSF Scorecard report, which you can try out yourself in the Scorecard repo at github.com OSSF Scorecard. Next slide. All right, so next I'll be passing it over to Laurent, a Scorecard maintainer, for a deeper dive into Scorecard and how the project works under the hood.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Caroline. That was a great intro to Scorecard. So I'm going to give you an overview, more of a technical overview of how the code base of Scorecard works. And so the main components of the Scorecard code base are the repository client, the checks, and the Scorecard run API. Next slide, please. So let's start with the repository client. So the repo client is basically just a Golang interface that defines the interface of the CVS, the control versioning system, with the rest of the code base of Scorecard. And so at a high level, the role of the repo client is to abstract away all the complexity of talking to platforms like GitHub and GitLab, and provides a snapshot of the information, makes the information available in a way that is agnostic to the platform that we're interested in. Next, so on the slide here, I have a snippet of the code which defines the repo client interface. And you can see a list of APIs that every implementation needs to implement. Next slide, please. So as of today, we have 2 client implementations. We have a GitLab implementation and a GitHub implementation. Not surprisingly, each of these implementation makes use in a lot of the platform-specific APIs. So in the case of GitHub, we make use a lot of the GraphQL APIs because they allow us to retrieve a lot of settings just in a single request. And when the GraphQL API doesn't provide the feature that we're after, we often fall back to the RESTful API. And I invite you to take a look at the GitLab implementation to see how it works under the hood as well. Next slide, please. The next big component of Scorecard, as Caroline mentioned, are the checks. And the checks are kind of subdivided into 3 layers. So I'm going to refer to those layers as first what I call the raw result layer. I'll talk about what it does in a minute. The result of this first layer is passed down to the second layer, which is the probe layer. And then the result of the probe layer is passed down to the last layer, which is the evaluation layer. So let me start with the first layer, which is the raw result layer. So the raw result layer, you can think of it as its role is to basically use the repo client that I introduced earlier and gather all the information from a repository, all the information that we can, and that might be needed to perform checks, to implement the checks. So not only this layer is not only responsible for gathering the information, but it's also responsible for caching it. So you can think of it as a snapshot of all the metadata that we might want to have about a repository. And we cache this information so that if different checks want to access the same kind of information, we don't have to repeatedly query the API on GitHub. For example, if a lot of the checks require reading the files or looking at the list of files or looking at some settings, and we'll only query this once and make it available through this snapshot to all the checks. One example is for the branch protection check. We need access to the settings, but we also need access to files, or at least their presence. We look, for example, for the presence of a file called the code owner file. Next layer, next slide, please. All right, so now that we have a snapshot of everything that we need about a repository, we run what we call the probe layer. This is still work in progress, and it's not yet released, but we're hoping that we're going to release it soon, maybe in Q2. So what the probe does is it takes as input the snapshot from the earlier layer, and then it runs some logic and outputs a low-level claim about a project. So a check is typically made up of multiple probes, and each of those probes has a clear description and a clear set of remediation. For example, to get back again to the example of the branch protection check, there are around probably 8 or 9 probes in this check. Each of those probes typically map to a setting in the branch protection setting. I can give you another example under the branch protection check, which is the requires code owner review probe. So this probe, its goal is to determine if the code owners need to approve pull request. And it typically uses several data points from the snapshot, such as the settings and the code owner file. So these are what the probes do under the hood. That's where the most of the logic really happens. Once the probes have run, they output a list of findings, and we feed this in the next layer, which is the evaluation layer. The evaluation layer has a very simple task, which is to just read the probe results or the findings and compute a score for each check. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I've basically copy-pasted the implementation of the branch protection check. And all the checks follow the exact same structure. So this just illustrates what I talked about earlier. You see in red at the top, you have the raw result part of the check, which is called. And then that data is fed into the probe, which you see a little bit below in the yellow color. And then those probe findings are fed into the green color square, which is the scoring part. Next slide, please. Here, I wanted to give you an example of what a probe looks like. So this file here is the definition of a probe. You can see it's a YAML formatted file. It contains a list of fields such as, what's the motivation for the probe, how it's implemented, and so on and so forth. And at the bottom, I've highlighted the remediation part. So I said that we're working on making the remediation part really easy to use and step-by-step remediation so that users don't have to waste their time finding the information online, and they can we can shorten the time to remediation for maintainers. Next slide, please. All right, so the next, I think I've said everything I had to say about the probes or the checks. I'd like to finish this part with the API, the Run API. So this is the kind of the entry point of the Scorecard Golang API. It has a very simple job. It just looks at all the checks that are enabled, and then it launches them in a Go routine so that they run in parallel to speed up the execution. Next slide, please. So I'd like to move on to a different topic, which isn't really technical, but I'd like to give you some insight about how we've been collaborating over the past 2 years. And I think Caroline has already touched on it, but I've put a little bit more content in this slide to give you more insights. So as you may know, we have weekly public meetings that everyone can attend. So far in the past 3 years, we have had contributors from 100 different people. We have recently grown the number of contributors and triagers. Caroline talked about this as well. And we have 3 active maintainers. Next month at the Linux Open Source Summit, sorry, not Linux, the Open Source Security Summit in Seattle, we are going to host a contributor workshop. So you are all encouraged to come and talk to us, and hopefully you'll be excited to send your first PR. I also want to highlight the work that we've done in the community by partnering with companies like GitHub and Google very early on in the project. GitHub has been very, very useful and is still very useful. And we've partnered with them when we developed the GitHub action about 2 years ago. And recently, they just launched, I think just 3 days ago, they announced a new API for checking private vulnerability reporting. That's a feature that they announced last year, where you can disclose privately vulnerabilities to maintainers, but there was no API to get that information. So we worked with GitHub, and they just announced that there is now this API is available. So we're going to be able to improve some of our checks and encourage maintainers to enable this feature. The work that we've done on the probe layer that I talked earlier is work that we've done in collaboration with a third-party vendor, both on the implementation and the design side. The work was also funded by AWS, by Amazon, which was really great, and thanks to them for helping us out here. We've also done a lot of discussion with various people who use Scorecard, such as IBM, CNCF, and so on and so forth, to try to refine the implementation and design. I would also like to call out the Google Upstream team, which is a team that we have at Google, and their goal is to engage with large open source projects on GitHub and GitLab and help them remediate some of the Scorecard findings. So they have some pretty impressive stats. Last year alone, they opened around over 400 pull requests, and about 70% of them were merged. And I think that speaks to the the impact that Scorecard is having on the community with its project. Next slide, please. Something else I wanted to touch on was the recognition of Scorecard in the community. So Scorecard is very often mentioned to the government every time we engage with governments. So for example, Google often promotes the use of Scorecard in its consultation with the White House, and also praised Scorecard as a tool that is really useful as part of the request for information of last year about supply chain security. Not surprisingly, the OpenSSF also promotes Scorecard to the US government, and I think has talked to NIST as well about it. I also wanted to highlight that Scorecard is involved in research. We've had reports from Sonotype that try to correlate project security to the output of Scorecard. And we also have ongoing collaboration with academia, in particular at North Carolina State University, where we're working on understanding the effectiveness of Scorecard checks and also improving them so that they better match. They are more more useful to different ecosystems. Next slide, please. And then to finish, I wanted to mention some projects and some large open source organizations that are using Scorecard. In particular, the Node.js Security Working Group has developed a tool called the Scorecard Monitor that they use to monitor all their repositories on GitHub. And the CNCF has a similar project to encourage and monitor best practices around supply chain for their repository. Next slide, please.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Laurent. It's awesome to celebrate the impact of Scorecard and all the hard work that all the contributors have made over these past few years. And there's definitely a wealth of information that you discussed with Scorecard under the hood, especially for us contributors. So thank you so much for that. Next, I would like to switch it to the user perspective of Scorecard. So in this next section, insights from implementing organizations, we'll start with Chris to talk about how he uses it in his team.
Thank you. So this is a summary slide that I've used at the end of some presentations I've put together about implementing scorecards in an organization. So as I said at the intros at the top, we've implemented Scorecard because we see it as a way that we can show that we care about security. And we first saw that with Dart and Flutter, two large Google projects. And they did a blog post about how they'd implemented Scorecard for their repos. And that kind of gave us a nudge to say, yeah, hey, there's something here that we should be taking a look at. And maybe this is going to be helpful in customer conversations. Something that we can point to say, yeah, we do care about security. You can take a look at our Scorecard badges on our key repos, and there's a very visible marker of what we're doing. When it came to doing our implementation, which we started at the end of last year, we began with a different OpenSSF project, a thing called All-Star. So All-Star is a GitHub application that can be installed at an organizational level. And it's really a sort of nag bot, which will look at the content and configuration of repos on either an opt-in or opt-out basis and tell you when it's seeing policy violations. So for things like making sure that we didn't have any binary artifacts in our repos, All-Star kind of cleared the way before we got started with Scorecard itself. When it came to putting Scorecard in place, we kind of picked a representative repo first. And actually, I picked one of our sort of most complex ones, which is the repo containing the core implementation of our personal data service called @server. And that gave us an opportunity to find out really what was involved in clearing up a repo to get a good score. And so, things like branch protection, but the majority of the effort there was in dependency pinning. So if I think about the hundreds of issues that were flagged up by Scorecard when it was first installed as a GitHub action, probably not more than a handful of those were things other than dependency pinning. And we were then able to make use of some of the tools that were pointed to by the Scorecard system, so things like step security, to take our YAML files for various pieces of config, run them through and get security dependency pinning in place against shards. And that resolved the vast majority of things. Once we'd done that first repo, it was then a question of taking the lessons learned from that and to the extent that we could, automating that across the rest of the organization. So this is largely about ensuring that you've got the right content and config for the repos that are having Scorecards applied to them. So in terms of content, that's having things like a security.md in the repo. And we'd already started out with templates and trying to make sure that we were kind of getting ticks across the board for the community insights inside of GitHub. But there were a few more security specific things that Scorecard pushed us to adopt. Then when it comes to config, and that's things like branch protection. So Laurent was just actually talking through aspects of that check. And we'd already put sort of low levels of branch protection in place because we do trunk-based development. And it's really the only safe way to do trunk-based development is with branch protection. But Scorecard encouraged us to really sharpen up the rules that we had around branch protection, ensure that we were doing things like CI checks and that we had mandatory reviews and that people weren't sort of marking their own homework so that reviews were being done by somebody other than the last pusher to repositories. I'd say that this is a bit of a Pareto thing. On reflection, it took kind of 20% of the effort to get 80% of the score. And if 80% of the score is a score of 8, and that's getting you a green badge, then that's probably a reasonable place to be landing. But it's an uphill slog from there. And one of the checks in Scorecard is for OpenSSF best practices, previously CII best practices, which is an enormous questionnaire which kind of takes you into a whole variety of things where checks can't necessarily be automated. And it's covering a lot of the NIST cybersecurity framework and asking you questions about how you deal with all sorts of different aspects of security. And that's just, it's a lot of work to get that done. And so that's one of the things that we left a little while, and it's only kind of later on as we've gone back to sharpen up the scores that we've engaged with that work. And that's got us from maybe low 8s to high 8s, but other parts of that uphill journey are implementing things like dynamic testing, fuzzing, and that's going to be really hard. It's very dependent on which languages and frameworks you're using and whether there's even suitable tools there to be deployed. Finally, I'd note that Scorecards create a degree of ongoing toil that needs to be minimized. So once you start doing things like dependency pinning, you're then getting an awful lot of work in keeping dependencies up to date. And so I get up every morning to generally a pile of Dependabot PRs that all need to be reviewed and then merged. One of the things we've done to help with that is to roll up PRs so that we only have to do sort of one run of the CI rather than if you don't do that, you're kind of waiting around for successive CI runs in order to get things reviewed, merged, and that becomes a bit of a pain. So wrapping up, I think it's been a good thing for us when we are talking to customers and prospects about security. They like that we've done Scorecard, and it's a very visible thing that they can go and look at, but also check into. And that's helpful for us in terms of moving conversations forward. And I'll pass back so that we can have our next customer story.
Great, thank you, Chris. Thank you for a realistic perspective of how your company uses Scorecard. Next, I'll pass it to Melba to talk about how IBM CISO uses Scorecard next.
Thanks, Caroline. So I'm going to be taking a different perspective here in terms of why we use Scorecard. If you look at the graph on the right, this is an IBM perspective of what it means year over year to have been doing SBOM analysis. There's been a 2,327% increase year over year. Us, IBM CISO, doing SBOM analysis. Let that sink in. If you think about hundreds or potentially thousands of packages that we have to assess quickly in order to be able to scale with that trend. So one of the key reasons why we're using Scorecard is to help with this SBOM assessment versus trying to do more like product security or repo security. It's really an SBOM assessment perspective. And so what that's been able to do for us is give us the ability to see what the third-party open source hygiene is, right? Are you using out-of-date packages? Are you using a community that is not maintained, right? So that's the key business value from an OpenSSF Scorecard perspective to IBM CISO, is being able to quickly see what that open source hygiene is. And the areas that we actually use this for are several different areas. One is third-party security risk management. We assess our suppliers, SBOMs, vendors, SBOMs, OEMs. Anybody that we may potentially do business with or may incorporate that into our product, we're going to do this assessment. Mergers and acquisitions, same concept. It can be a target acquisition that's coming into IBM. Well, are we going to be buying crap in terms of open source hygiene? Or can we say, yes, this product is using the best of the best, and those communities are doing what they need to do from a secure development perspective. Same thing with IBM product security, right? We can assess our own products with Scorecard based off the SBOM. And lastly, but certainly not least, open source security. Anytime the IBM product team comes to us and says, hey, we want to use these new open source packages in our products, it's more than just legal clearance. A lot of people just think, okay, license. It's more than just license. What about the security of that open source package, right? And so we're using Scorecard for a variety of different use cases. And mainly it's for the SBOM analysis to be able to assess the open source hygiene. Can you move on to the next slide? And so when we think about, risk, right? Risk is more than just vulnerabilities. And OpenSSF Scorecard understands that, right? They have a little bit of the license play, which is legal for us, right? They have some vulnerability, they have some secure development. So all the different checks of OpenSSF Scorecard, we've basically divided them up into what we call 4 core categories. We have cybersecurity, secure development, policy, and business impact really is not in the Scorecard domain, but that's our 4th category, right? If you think about the branch protection check that was talked about, or that was talked about previously, well, how are you doing code integrity? How's your build integrity, right? That one check isn't necessarily cybersecurity for us. Cybersecurity is more about vulnerabilities, right? So we can divide up those different checks into these different categories and add our own special sauce to be able to assess an SBOM out of one of many tools, right? Because we have our own scanners. We have vulnerability scanners, we have license scanners, et cetera, et cetera. So OpenSSF Scorecard can be a very valuable tool in your supply chain security toolkit. I'm a big proponent of there's no one silver bullet. You need a toolkit for software supply chain risk management. And so we're using OpenSSF Scorecard, as such. So again, it can be used to assess community health, right? Because risk is beyond vulnerabilities. Community health, what does that mean? Well, is it being maintained, right? Is the community even doing the right things in terms of secure development? Are they doing peer reviews? And then obviously I mentioned earlier legal risk there's some licensing aspect. I think the key for that one, we have to build in our own logic because the Scorecard itself just kind of looks for the presence of that license file, but we as IBM have certain licenses that we can or can't use. So that's kind of like a business impact logic. And then OpenSSF Scorecard, I know, there's GitHub Actions, et cetera, but a lot of our teams are using GitHub Enterprise. It's an internal, it's not external. So we can use OpenSSF Scorecard to check what our product teams are doing internally and some of the features may not necessarily be available from an automation standpoint. So we have to create our own automation to enable it in our CI/CD pipeline to use Scorecard. So in a nutshell, it's been, a really interesting journey since 2022, taking an SBOM, taking the assessment of a very small SBOM with Scorecard analysis manually, and then being able to do it at scale to see, hey, here are all the dependencies in this potential acquisition or potential a supplier that we want to do business with. And you're seeing a range of, potential packages that are from like 2010 that's not been updated since, right? That kind of key visibility is important to understand open source hygiene. And our suppliers are very much liking some of the feedback that we're giving them, saying, hey, well, why is this in your product? And then they realize, oh, maybe that might be legacy, et cetera. So overall, it's been a really good experience using OpenSSF Scorecard. Obviously, there's room for improvement with any technology, but we're definitely looking forward to the next iteration of Scorecard. That's it. Go ahead,
Great.
Caroline.
Thank you so much, Melba. All right, next slide. Okay, so next I'd like to pivot to the panel discussion. In this section, I have compiled a couple questions here that I'll be giving to the panelists to answer in a couple minutes. So let's start. So this one is for Laurent. What was the original intention for starting OpenSSF Scorecard, and how has it changed based on the feedback from users?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think everyone kind of touched on that topic already, but I think there were two main goals when we created Scorecard. The first was to basically help maintainers improve their security practices, because it's pretty not obvious the risk that you have in your repository based on the practices that you have. So that was one of the first goals. And the second goal was to provide some visibility for consumers to be able to maybe select different dependencies based on the risks that those dependencies are taking. So I think those were the two main goals, and those are the two ways that Scorecard are still used today. In terms of how we have evolved, I think we've been mostly listening to a lot of the feedback that we've received. So one of the things that we've started working on, which I mentioned in the talk earlier, was the concept of a probe. So a probe is a smaller component than a check. It's very granular, and we expect that once we release those, it will allow consumers to implement policies on top of the Scorecard results. The today policies are not really easy to implement because there's only a score, and the score isn't very fine-grained. It's too coarse, and it's not obvious even to the maintainers what a score means in a particular check. So having a mapping between score and what it means is a little bit difficult, and we think we can resolve this problem with the introduction of the probes. So that's one thing that we did. Another ongoing work that we have is around configuration for maintainers. So when you install the Scorecard action, I think maintainers have been telling us that not all the checks apply to every ecosystem in the same way. And so we want to provide more flexibility for users to be able to disable some checks or enable some checks that are not run by default. And we would also love to encourage consumers and producers, maintainers, to kind of have a bi-directional way of communicating. So we're hoping that as part of this configuration option, maintainers can actually explain why they disable certain checks or why they are failing certain checks, so that when you get them from the BigQuery table or the REST API, as a consumer, you can actually read and understand why some of the checks might be failing, even though, and maybe those checks are not relevant for specific reasons. So I think what we've learned is that there's a lot of variations, and there isn't like a one-size-fits-all sort of configuration. And I think what we've tried to do is kind of evolve and make Scorecard a little bit more flexible, both for maintainers and consumers. This is still work in progress, obviously, but we're hoping to get there in the long run.
Great, thank you so much. It's great to hear the flexibility of Scorecard, and of course, it's always a work in progress. All right, so next question is, how long have you been using Scorecard? So this is for the users, so I'll start with Melba, and then Chris can go next.
Yeah, so I mentioned this earlier, been using Scorecard since about early 2022. I first discovered it in the fourth quarter of 2021 because a colleague of mine on my team had mentioned it. And I started tinkering with it then, and then it's kind of exploded since 2022, as you've seen. I'll hand it over to Chris.
So we started using All-Star in the summer of 2022, and then Scorecard kind of got implemented across our key repos towards the end of 2022. So it's been a little over a year now, and it's kind of in the end of last year was when we kind of went back to each of those repos and really pushed hard to get everything above an 8. So previously we'd kind of landed in a sort of mid 7s into low 8s, and we had a concerted effort to get kind of everything into the 8+ territory, which meant a lot of those best practices, questionnaires, etc.
Great, thank you so much. Next question, what kind of work were you involved in before utilizing Scorecard, and what provided you with the foundation and experience to use Scorecard?
So I'll bite that one off.
Great.
A part of my role is what I would describe as platform engineering. So when I joined the organization, one of the first things that I did was push for front-based development, and then put in place CI and CD based upon GitHub Actions. I'd done a lot of work with GitHub in my previous job, and so I think some knowledge of how to configure GitHub and build things like template repos was certainly helpful in the implementation of Scorecard, particularly as a GitHub action. The other aspect to it is an understanding of security, and I've previously had security roles in organizations. If I go back to when I was working in banks, I used to have job titles that had security in. I think it's kind of the Hotel California of IT. So I checked out long ago, but I'm not allowed to leave. And so this is one of the things that's kind of sucked me back into doing security related work.
For myself, I was, prior to this role that I'm in right now, I was at VMware as a global vulnerability management manager. I was promoted as a manager, as an engineer, had been working there for several years, and then I switched over that fourth quarter into IBM software supply chain security. I had no clue what I was doing, right? So it was a new area for me. And so I really just dove deep. I tried to, reach out to any IBMer that understood what supply chain security meant, what open source meant, et cetera. So there were several colleagues on the IBM open source security team that I interfaced with, and they're the ones that introduced me to OpenSSF and Scorecard, et cetera. So it was really a way for me to understand what I was going to be expected to try to do / protect, and how to potentially protect. And that's kind of how I got started with Scorecard. And since then, right, like I said, it's been kind of like a snowball effect. Now it's one of many tools that I use for software supply chain security, and it's been a fantastic tool so far.
Great, thank you, guys. It's interesting to hear that it seems like it was an organic stumbling upon the tool, but it ends up making such a great impact. So next question, what challenges is our community currently facing, and how can we collectively address these challenges?
I guess I could take that first. So I would say from my perspective, right, typically an SBOM that I analyze might have 10,000 packages, right? Try to make sense of all those scorecard scores for 10, there's 18 checks, multiply that by 10,000 or more packages. How do you make sense of that, right? Yes, there's the aggregate score, but then you take that aggregate score and you multiply that by 10,000. What does that mean, right? We've had to create our own kind of logic, and even then it's not perfect. But if you think of using OpenSSF Scorecard at scale, right, with thousands and thousands of packages, what does that mean for the person that's analyzing, whether it be that repo or that product? I think there's a need there, right? We shouldn't all have to, come up with our own secret sauce, so to speak, right? We should be able to give the industry the ability to say, okay, this means that, maybe let's say 80% of this SBOM, as an example, is really good, but there's just 20%. What do I need to do as a consumer, right, of this potential package or this potential product, right? I need to better understand what I should do without digging, right? Yes, I can get the metrics in, but the scale of those metrics and what to do with it is a big challenge. It's not just Scorecard, any tools, right? But I think that is a challenge that if we can solve in the open source community for the masses of general representation of here are the recommendations, I think that would be extremely useful, right? And I know I've talked to Caroline about some of these things, and so some of my feedback might, make its way through Caroline. But I think that is my biggest concern currently, and what I'm seeing, not just at IBM, but in other companies as well. Chris?
So I'll start with a broad perspective and then maybe come back to something a bit narrower. So the broad issue that I see is unsafe defaults in the platforms. So if we take something like GitHub, the defaults are very much there so that you as a lone developer can come along and start a repo and be productive and not get in your own way too much. And as you kind of switch into a mature organizational mode and you're trying to do continuous delivery and some of the underlying disciplines involved in that, such as trunk-based development, you do not want those initial defaults. You almost want a big switch where you can kind of go, okay, I'm going to go into adult mode now. And that means branch protection. That means, in fact, just a lot of the things that are checked by Scorecard. So if we could have organizational defaults that were well aligned to the things that are measured by a scorecard, that would help out enormously and save a whole bunch of yak shaving for that content and config that I was kind of talking about beating into shape earlier on. If I then kind of step into a narrower view, and Lawrence touched upon this a little bit from his maintainer's perspective, I'm a big believer in release early, release often. And as some of the new changes in Scorecard are being implemented, it means that it's been a while since there's been a release. And so, the thing that I was niggling at last week, it's kind of there in trunk, but it's not there yet in a release that can be used by the GitHub action. And so there's functionality that you kind of expect to find because it's there and it's in the documentation even, but it's not yet available in the kind of easy served up through the action mechanism. And so I'm hopeful that soon the project's going to kind of be back over the hump and into releasing often.
Great, thank you. So looking ahead, next question is, looking ahead to the near future, what developments can we anticipate considering the challenges we're currently confronting?
That sounds like a Laurent question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Looking ahead to the near future, what developments can we anticipate considering the challenges we're currently confronting?
Right. I think the two features that we have in the pipeline are going to help both consumers and so the one that I mentioned earlier, like configuration for maintainers and fine-grained results for consumers is going to help. But I don't think it's gonna fix the scalability part that Melba talked about. So I think short term, those are the two features that I think are going to help. Well, at least that's my opinion. I think it will help with adoption on the maintainer side of things because, like Chris said, there is a little bit of noise already, and there's also noise in the when you install the GitHub action. You're going to have a list of signals or alerts in the GitHub dashboard, and you need to take a look at this. So some people want to, remove the noise. Maybe they don't want to pin their dependencies for some reasons. So I think that will help with adoption. And on the consumer side, I think these fine-grained results are going to probably help also with scalability because you're not going to have to go through this proxy of a score, which basically kind of like dilutes the information. It isn't really, particularly useful. I guess you could look at the scores per check. So I guess that's probably a good proxy today, but I think we can do better. But then long term, I don't think I have a good answer yet on, how do you interpret Scorecard for a huge SBOM? I don't even know if that's Scorecard's mission. It looks like almost like a different project or how you interpret the results. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think we're open for suggestions and ideas on this side of things.
Awesome, thank you. Let's pivot so we can go to the next slide, and we only have a couple minutes left, so we might answer one, maybe two audience questions. So I'll start with this first one. What's the relationship between All-Star and Scorecard going forward? They seem to have a lot of overlap of very different implementations.
Has anyone answered this question yet? Or?
I think if you can take it, that would be great.
Okay. So I think the vision for Scorecard and All-Star is that All-Star would basically use the Scorecard, like the Scorecard API under the hood, which is, it already does, but there's some duplication on the part where you get the settings. So I think today All-Star does two things. It retrieves the settings on its own and add a bit of policy logic. And it also uses the Scorecard API, which I presented, the run Scorecard API, to use to retrieve additional information from different checks. So I think I can't speak on behalf of Jeff, who is I think one of the main maintainers, but I think the vision is to try to have Scorecard as the main engine and All-Star as just the policy / remediation engine, where you would say, this is what I care about based on the Scorecard result. And All-Star would create PRs, maybe block, remediate automatically based on the, the remediation that Scorecard provides. So I think that's how it might move forward. But we might also ask Jeff whether he agrees with that vision or not.
Great. And this is a great plug for the community meetings where there's a lot of interesting discussions that go pretty deep in the weeds. So highly encourage everyone to participate there or the Slack channel on the OpenSSF Slack workspace. So next, I would like to move to the closing remarks since we have a couple of slides to cover. And I know there are a couple questions, so feel free to ask the Slack channel. Everyone there is happy to answer your questions there. So first, how was this tech talk? Please tell us your feedback. There's this QR code and link. We would love to hear what you thought of this first OpenSSF Tech Talk. So highly encourage you to go here. And next slide. This is a separate survey. So OpenSSF Scorecard has an ongoing survey for users and developers of Scorecard to get your feedback of what you think of the tool. So please check out this survey and give us your thoughts. It will help with adding to different features that you're interested in, and feel free to add comments of any limitations that you've experienced in Scorecard so far. Okay, next slide. So there's a free course on Scorecard. There's so many resources available, so I highly encourage you to take advantage of all of them. This is on the Linux Foundation and Training Certification platform, so definitely check this out. And it's free. Who doesn't love free? Next slide. An upcoming event. I think Lauren mentioned this earlier, but at the Linux Foundation's Open Source Summit North America, it's in April in Seattle. And so these are the two Scorecard related talks, a workshop and a talk with great details that you can check out in person. Next slide. Different ways to participate. I've alluded to the Slacks and meetings. There's all the links here. Next slide. And yes, check us out on social media as well for more notifications on talks like this and other events going on. Next slide. And subscribe to the mailing list. I think this is the last one. Next slide. Okay, and join if your organization's a member. Check us out there. Okay, thank you. We got it 1 minute to spare. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for a great discussion. Thank you to all of the panelists for your great insights, and thank you very much. And take the surveys. Don't forget about the surveys.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks. All right, bye everyone.
Bye everyone.